Alrighty. So we left off last class talking about spinal nerves. Spinal nerves. Oops. 31 pairs. Mixed nerves. What's that mean? Yeah, nerves. Remember what nerves were? I don't want to go way, way back, but if you look in your textbook on page 491, we see the setup of those nerves. So we can have sensory and motor axons or fibers in any given nerve group. 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal is what we have for spinal nerves. So we see them outlined here on page 508 in your textbook. And they're named for the vertebrae in which they enter. So each of those nerves is going to connect to the spinal cord in 2 ways. So we're going to see 2 branches. We're going to see the ventral root. Ventral is going to be what? Ventral motor. Think ventral motor. Or, what's another name for motor? Efferent, efferent. And that's going to innervate skeletal muscles. And then we have dorsal root. Dorsal is sensory. Information is going to come in through the dorsal root of the spinal nerves. We see them here in this diagram, and we can see how they branch and spread. So we see the dorsal in the back, the ventral in the front, feeding into the spinal cord. Now all those little roots we talked about before is where the message is then going to get handed off. So some of those white matter tracts will then bring that information up for processing in the central nervous system, and then those tracts that bring information down or descend to motor will then exit which branch? Ventral is motor. Yes? So spinal nerves tend to be quite short at those branches. Each of the branches has mixed sensory and motor, what we call Rami, dorsal, ventral, meningeal branches, and then something called the Rami communicans, which is autonomic information that's being sent. Autonomic is what? Automatic. Give me an example of autonomic. Heartbeat. Information for heartbeat, breathing. So, some of the different groups of Rami that we're going to see, all ventral Rami, except for some of the thoracic ones, form a group of intertwining fibers called plexuses. We have a cervical plexus, brachial plexus, a lumbar, and a sacral plexus. I don't need to point out where those are at this point, I hope. Everybody knows where those are. Neck, what's brachial? Going out to where? That arm, lumbar, lower back, sacral, lower limbs. Some of these different plexuses have fibers that crisscross. We can see in this diagram on page 502 how some of the branches innervate different groups of skeletal muscle. Clicker! When you first enter a movie theater, the smell of popcorn overwhelms you and, of course, makes you go and buy some for the movie. Once the movie is ended, however, you don't notice the popcorn smell. You have experienced what? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Click something just so I can get your attendance if you haven't clicked. What's the answer? D, adaptation. Good. So, cervical plexus and the neck region. Now, we're going to go very basic with this information. The book gets a little crazy, but I just want you to have a basic definition and understanding of where that plexus of nerves serves. So, most of the branches form cutaneous nerve, and where is the innervation going to take place? Everybody understands what I mean by innervation at this point, yes? What's that mean? What's it going to innervate? The cutaneous nerves are going to innervate. What's that mean? I got coffee. I can wait. What do nerves do to the neck, ear, back of the head, shoulders? What do? They're going to what? Yeah, cause them to do something. Innervate, send a message to, stimulate. That's what innervate means. Other branches innervate neck muscles, cause them to contract. Yes? Phrenic nerve. That's the guy that gives us the hiccups when it's irritated. Diaphragm is its target. So we see a diagram on page 503 that shows us some of these different nerve groups in the cervical plexus. Am I going to make you memorize all the nerves in the cervical plexus? No. But just have that general information from the outline. Yes? Okay. And this is table at the bottom of that page on 503 that goes through the specifics for those different nerves associated with the cervical plexus. Brachial plexus, up in the, where? Yeah, in the arm region. We're looking at page 504 for this. Forms the ventral Rami, crisscrossed fibers that are innervating, sending message to and from, bringing stuff from where? The upper limbs. So, major branches of this plexus are roots, trunks, divisions, and cords. We see a picture of that again on page 504 that shows us where all of these different portions are located. What I want you to understand about this plexus is what? Its target. So these are 5 important nerves in this plexus and their targets. So axillary, musculocutaneous, median, ulnar, radial. You know all of these, don't you? Except for the musculocutaneous one. Axillary you should know. You should know it from what? Chapter 1. Chapter 1. Because you know that region, right? So if you understand where the brachial plexus is innervating, you know where axillary is. Musculocutaneous, what's that mean? Skin muscles, exactly. So innervates some surface muscles that cause movement, like the biceps brachii, the brachialis. You'll learn these when we learn muscles. Median, where are we going down now? Down lower. Ulnar, where's the ulna? Where's the radius? Yeah, which one's which? Radial's on the thumb side, yes. So that nerve is going to innervate things on that thumb side of the arm, and the ulna is going to innervate things on the pinky side of the arm, yes. We see a picture of those on page 504 also, with a nice little diagram giving us all of their targets. Clicker! See, I'm keeping you on your toes today. Which cranial nerve is the exception to the rule and travels to the thoracic and abdominal cavities? If you listen to the last lecture, I sort of mentioned this one. If you were awake for the last lecture, I kind of mentioned this one. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. What's the answer? Vagus. Remember I said we go out to Vegas, outside to Vegas to have a party. We leave that E. I like E. Thank you, E. All right. And then we go down to the lumbar plexus. Rises from L1 to L4, lower limbs. Femoral nerve, obturator nerve, and these are named for some of the markings on the bones in which they pass through or pass beside. They're going to help innervate muscles in that lower leg. We see this diagram on page 507 with the nice little diagram at the bottom to help tell us where everybody is. And then we have the sacral plexus. L4 to S4 serves the butt region, lower limbs, pelvic structures, perineum. What's a perineum? Go look it up. Sciatic nerve. You what? Oh, water. Yeah, that is. All right, sciatic. Longest, thickest nerve of the body. Some of you who may have had children have experienced the pleasure of the sciatic nerve. It runs from that lower lumbar region all the way down the back of your leg to the foot. Innervates a bunch of different muscles down there and can cause all sorts of problems if it gets squished on by the pressure of that child. Composed of two nerves, a tibial and common fibular. You know where your tibia and your fibula is, fibula, correct? We see a picture on page 508 of some of the nerves associated with the sacral plexus. We also see the coccygeal guy down there at the bottom, and where that nerve group or groups of nerves is distributed in the lower limbs, with a nice little diagram there. We have the anterolateral thorax and abdominal wall. You were probably saying she forgot the thoracic region. Oh, no, 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 I did not. So ventral rami in the thorax, simple segmental patterns, innervate muscles in that thoracic region. Cutaneous branches go to the skin, and posterior body trunk, those muscles in the back in the thoracic region. We see a diagram on page 510 that maps out some skin regions that can help doctors determine how some of these nerve groups are acting, or if they're acting up. And some of these areas that we can look at cutaneously, the cutaneous branches of many of these groups of spinal nerves are called dermatomes. So all spinal nerves except for the first C1 have some sort of place on that superficial skin that they're going to innervate. And then we can see, judging by reactions to touch in those areas, gives the doctor some sort of beginning assessment for those nerve groups. So most of the dermatomes overlap a little bit. And we see that figure 13.13 on page 510. So, which nerves serve which synovial joints? To remember this, we remember Hinton's law, or Hilton's, excuse me. Any nerve serving a muscle that produces a movement at the joint also innervates the joint and the skin over the joint. Peripheral nervous system. Elements that activate effectors by releasing neurotransmitters. So they give us a little review of innervation of skeletal muscle. Remember, what happens at the neuromuscular junction? Yes? And this is basically what this is going to go through. Neurotransmitter. We'll use acetylcholine. Is that the only neurotransmitter we can have? No. Name another one. Histamine's a neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine's a neurotransmitter. Dopamine's a neurotransmitter. So, neurotransmitters are going to be released after nerve impulse. Action potential takes place. Receptor on the postsynaptic neuron is going to bind with the acetylcholine, resulting in what? Depolarization due to what? Yeah, influx. So the movement of those ions in the beginning, sodium rushes in across the membrane. Depolarization of the membrane. Do you know what depolarization means? What does it mean? So we're going to change in charge. Remember, when a membrane is polarized, what does that mean? It means that it's more positive on the outside, more negative on the inside. When it becomes depolarized, we're going to have more positive, we're going to have an opposite. So more positive ions are going to rush in. And that's going to happen at the end plate. We call it end plate potential, and that's going to trigger the action potential. Only if we have enough sodium rushing in to change the charge enough to reach what? Yeah, threshold, minus 55 millivolts. In this case, when we talk about a motor end plate, we're talking about motor neurons innervating who? What do motor neurons innervate? Muscles, skeletal muscle. So instead of getting that change, when we talk about muscles, we'll talk about this. Instead of getting that change in the postsynaptic neuron, we're actually going to get the same kind of chemical changes going on in a muscle cell to cause it to contract. So, action potential arrives at the axon. Calcium, with the help of calcium, we're going to push out what? The little green balls. What are the little green balls? No. They're exocytosis, but what's the little green balls? Acetylcholine is those little green balls, and they're in the vesicles that are going to be pushed out. Yes? They're going to diffuse from high concentration to low concentration, and what are they going to do? They're going to come in contact with receptors on the, in this case, we're talking about a muscle membrane. So that's where you see the word sarcolemma. So calcium is going to help push out the neurotransmitter into the synapse. Acetylcholine is going to diffuse across the synapse, come in contact with receptors, and we'll start the ball rolling as far as changing charge. Beginning of depolarization. Yes? That's just going to keep happening unless we degrade the acetylcholine. So in the synapse, we're also going to find enzymes that will help break down neurotransmitters. In this case, we see acetylcholine being degraded by an enzyme in the area. What's the name of the enzyme? We're always going to see ASE, at the end of the word, right? The name of the enzyme that degrades acetylcholine is acetylcholine esterase. Otherwise, this would just keep going. It's also going to diffuse out of the area as well. Clicker. A physician can determine the approximate location of a spinal injury simply by testing areas of the skin for numbness. What are these areas referred to as? Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Everybody click? Good. What's the answer? Dermatomes, not dermosomes. Let's see how we did. Oh, not bad. So, innervation of visceral muscles and glands. What are visceral muscles and glands? Internal organs. Glands are what? Part of the endocrine system. What are they going to make? Hormones. So, we have different innervation. Acetylcholine, norepinephrine act indirectly via second messenger systems to innervate visceral motor response. And these are what kind of cells? So we're not talking skeletal muscle when we talk internal organs. We're talking smooth muscle. Yes? So we see these little groups in extensions in the autonomic nervous system called varicosities. And this is where we're going to see the release of neurotransmitter for visceral innervation. So, different levels of motor control. Cerebellum, basal nuclei, they're the planners and coordinators for motor activities. Remember, any given movement is not simple. Not just one muscle, but many muscles have to be innervated in order for us to coordinate motor function. So we have segmental level, the projection level, and the precommand level that are going to be responsible for coordinating motor innervation. On page 512, figure 13.14, we see a summary of the different levels mentioned before and the players involved in coordinating motor output. So we have the segmental level, the lowest level. Reflexes, autonomic movements. Remember we talked about reflexes? We're going to talk in more detail in one moment about reflexes, but they're movements that are coordinated to happen very quickly before conscious perception. So reflexes and autonomic, automatic, breathing, heartbeat, all of that stuff, movements. So central pattern generators are going to help control movement and very specific repeated motor activity. We do very specific repeated motor activity all the time. We're constantly innervating heart muscle to contract. We're constantly innervating the diaphragm to help us breathe. We're constantly innervating a lot of different bodily functions to maintain homeostasis. And this is where we're going to coordinate them. So the projection level, next in line, the middleman, consists of upper motor neurons that initiate direct or pyramidal system to produce voluntary skeletal muscle movements. Brainstem and motor areas are also involved at the projection level. Remember, we're going up, we're kind of in the center region of the brain. Projection motor pathways are going to send information to lower motor neurons and keep higher command levels informed of what's going on. So during a reflex, these guys are going to take the ball and make sure that the perception level or the pre-command level, the highest level, knows what's going on. So that's next in line. Neurons in the cerebellum and the basal nuclei are then going to get handed off message and help to regulate motor activity, stop and start movements, coordinate movements, help with posture. All of these things have to be innervated on a regular basis when you are conscious, for example, so that you can stand up straight, so that you can sit up straight, so you can hold your head up while you're conscious. Yeah, so you don't fall down in your seat. Some of you actually do that too. So cerebellum and basal nuclei, again, and their involvement at the pre-command level acts to help motor pathways through projection areas of the brain. Again, passing off that message for processing and then for motor function. Acts on the motor cortex via the thalamus and fine-tunes motor activities. So some of these areas, when they're affected, we're going to have trouble fine-tuning our movements, having them be fluid and easy. They might be jerky. Basal nuclei inhibit various motor centers under resting conditions, slow things down. And again, we see that diagram on page 512 that gives us a summary of these different levels. We see some of the structures involved in levels of motor control and their interactions. Also on page 512, figure 13.14. The next thing the book talks about in part 4 is reflex activity. So, very rapid, involuntary, predictable motor response to stimulus. When you maintain your posture or control different visceral activities, like did anybody eat breakfast this morning? So what's going on? Yeah, food has to be digested. That's a process. We need to innervate tons of different muscles. We needed to innervate muscles in the face to chew the food. We needed to innervate muscles in the esophagus to swallow the food. And then we need to innervate muscles all the way down the rest of the tube for the digestive process. So that's what they're talking about when they talk about visceral activities. Can be modified by learning and conscious effort. So if something's coming at you very quickly, you can modify your movements if that happens over and over again. Like a boxer or like a tennis player, right? So things are coming at you quickly. When that happens to you the first time, you're either going to miss it or you're going to get hit by it, right? but you can train some of these reflex actions with repetitive learning. So learned and acquired reflexes result from practice or repetition. And any sport skill or playing an instrument, for example, fall into this category. So a reflex arc then consists of 5 basic components. Figure 13.15 on page 513 shows us a picture of these components. Do you need to know these? Yes, you do. So a reflex arc, a pathway of message, is always going to start with some sort of stimulus. So if I drop my book, of course I told you I was going to drop my book, so it didn't work so good. Now I got to go pick it up. Damn it. But what would have happened if I didn't tell you? Yeah, some sort of reaction. Usually a blink is involved, right? Why? Why do you think the body makes you blink? Or it protects what? Protect your eyes, exactly. So, always starts with something that's going to detect that stimulus called a receptor. Then we're going to take that information and send it where? Send it to the central nervous system, right? So that involves some sort of sensory neuron that has to take that message and send it to the central nervous system. Then we have to hand off the message to a couple of different players in the movement associated with the reflex. And that's going to happen in the integration center. The integration center is in the central nervous system, usually in the spinal cord, depending on which reflex we're talking about. We have to then hand that message off to who? Well, it's going to go to higher motor areas, but where else? Or higher brain regions, I should say. When I slammed my book on the ground, what'd you do? You blinked. What caused you to blink? Some sort of motor response. So the integration center is responsible for a couple of things. A, send the message up for perception, conscious awareness, but at the same time send the message to what? The motor neuron. The motor neuron is going to cause some sort of what? Reaction or effect. The last stage of a reflex arc would be the effect or the effector. Yes? So know that. Some of the different reflexes are then discussed in your textbook. Spinal reflexes, somatic reflexes that activate what? Skeletal muscle. Autonomic reflexes are going to innervate what? Some sort of visceral. So we're talking about smooth muscle or cardiac or gland innervation. Spinal reflexes can be tested to see how spinal nerve groups are doing. Integration centers in the spinal cord, and the effectors of spinal reflexes are skeletal muscle. So that part of the torture lab I talked about last class, we're going to look at some of these reflexes to see if you're all working properly. So, stretch and tendon reflexes are going to help coordinate skeletal muscles. They're going to help coordinate movements. They are associated with the length of a muscle or the amount of tension on a muscle. This is what's going to start the reflex arc going. So, they talk about something called spindles or muscle spindles. And this is groups of nerves associated with muscles in different areas to pick up the information we just mentioned. Composed of 3 to 10 modified skeletal muscle fibers called infusal muscle fibers. And these are usually wrapped around the extension of the coverings of muscles in tendons or in ligaments. And they are going to start to pick up message when muscles are being pulled on. These are a couple of the different endings that we find in these muscle spindles. And we're going to innervate due to the sensitivity of these fibers. So, when changes happen in muscle, when more pressure gets associated with muscle, and we see this on page 514 in our textbook, figure 13.16, we see the anatomy of muscle spindle and tendon organ and how they are associated with movements and coordinating muscle. So, muscle spindles are excited in two ways. There's got to be some sort of stretch or tension. So, external stretch of muscle and muscle spindle is going to innervate these guys. An internal stretch of muscle spindles is going to activate some of these pathways to communicate with the spinal cord to coordinate movements, to contract muscles when more tension is applied to them. So the stretch reflex is going to help maintain muscle tone in very large muscle groups that are going to help hold you upright. Stretch reflex activates muscle spindles. Sensory neurons synapse directly with the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, and the alpha motor neurons cause stretched muscles to contract. Again, so all of these guys are going to help with coordinated movements of muscles. We're going to look at the patellar reflex in class. Stretch muscles of the quadricep, contracts opposite muscles or antagonists or hamstrings, causing them to relax. So, in other words, when I bang on my patella, what happens to create the patellar reflex? Yes? In order for me to do that, what has to happen? These muscles, and what do they call them in the? Have to contract, and these muscles relax. So they're antagonists, and when we talk about muscles, we'll talk about antagonists and protagonists in any muscle movement or movement of a limb. They have to work that way, otherwise the movement isn't going to take place, right? Some have to relax, some have to contract. So, positive relax reactions indicate that sensory and motor connections between muscle and spinal cord are intact, and strength of response indicates the degree of the spinal cord excitability. So this can tell a doctor quite a bit about that particular group of nerves by just testing that little innervation of that group of muscles in the lower limb. Any disruption by lesions, for example, mentioned at the bottom, can cause problems with this movement. So, any gamma neuron stimulated by the brain, spindle stretches, contraction force maintained or increase. If gamma neurons are inhibited, spindle becomes non-responsive and muscles will relax. We see some of the events that occur in these stretch reflexes on page 516 under the focus, figure 13.18. So, when stretch activates the spindle, we send messages to the spinal cord sensory neurons are going to synapse directly with those who? In this case, who do they synapse directly with in this particular reflex? Yep, we're going to send motor information in one pathway to cause a reaction, and we're going to send motor information to another pathway to cause that antagonistic reaction. So we can have the contraction and the relaxation take place in this particular reflex.
So you're saying like the red is the one that has to be contracted, and the purple one is the one that has to be relaxed.
Correct. So do you see how we need to send both pathways, or else we're not going to have the movement? Does that make sense? So efferent impulses of alpha motor neurons cause contraction.
So some people must have genetic problems or defects where they can't do that.
Or problems with these nerve groups.
Right, so
Absolutely. And different diseases will cause problems with these nerve groups as well. So efferent impulses of alpha motor neurons to the antagonist muscle are reduced, and we have our kick. Yes? So all of these things are involved in the stretch reflex. And again, you'll test these out in lab, not next week, but the week we come back from Thanksgiving. So these are the steps involved in this reflex. So basically I want you to have a basic understanding of each of these reflexes. And we have something called the tendon reflex. Tendons are what? What are tendons? Connective tissue. Connecting what? Muscle to bone. So we have receptors in tendons, yes, we just talked about them a second ago, that are going to help us coordinate movements. Helps prevent damage due to exercise. Important for smooth onset and termination of muscle contraction. We don't want to keep contracting muscles too strongly, because we can actually cause damage to any given muscle group. So these are going to help slow down muscle contraction during any given movement. Produces muscle relaxation, lengthening in response to tension. Again, so reciprocal muscles can work together to cause any given movement. We see this on page 517, the tendon reflex, figure 13.19. Yeah, and that tendon organ strongly contracts. Afferent fibers synapse with interneurons in the spinal cord. And then we send efferent message impulses with stretch tendon that are dampened. So the muscle ends up doing what? You got to relax some muscles for this to reduce tension for the movement to take place. And then the efferent impulse to antagonist muscles, causing it to what? Contract. So that's the tendon reflex on page 517. The flexor and crossed-extensor reflex. And this is where the description is kind of self-explanatory. We actually send message to the opposite side of the body for a reaction in this particular reflex. So the flexor or withdrawal reflex, initiated by some sort of painful stimulus, causes autonomic withdrawal of threatened body part. We also send information to the opposite side of the body to help with protection. So ipsilateral and polysynaptic messages are being sent. So if I grab your arm, one of the things you're going to do besides try to pull away from me is raise your other arm. Yes? How come? Because of the ipsilateral and polysynaptic messages that are being sent to the opposite side of your body. So it's protective, it's important, and the brain can actually override it if we think really hard. And if you've ever gone to the doctor and had a finger stick, as an adult, what do you have to concentrate on? Not pulling your hand away. Do little children have this ability? They do, but they can't control it as well as you can. Huh? Yeah, it is, isn't it? You have to kind of hold them down, but because that reflex kicks in for them, but you can override this. Crossed-Extensor reflex occurs with flexor reflexes in weight-bearing limbs to maintain balance as well. And we see a diagram, figure 13.20, on page 518 in your textbook, showing us that crossed-extensor reflex. So, we have superficial reflexes, and sometimes we refer to them as tickles or itches, elicited by gentle cutaneous stimulation. Some of you might be familiar with the plantar reflex and an abdominal reflex. Another one is called the Babinski sign that we do for infants when we actually do a cutaneous stimulation at the bottom of the foot and see the way the foot moves. Again, we'll do these in lab. Abdominal reflexes test the integrity of those thoracic region nerve plexuses, T8 to T12. Developmental aspects of the nervous system. Spinal nerves branch from developing spinal cord and the neural crest that we talked about way back when. We're going to develop both motor and sensory fibers and cranial nerves that are going to innervate, for the most part, muscles in the head, except for vagus cranial nerve 10, who travels outside of the head region. And that's the end of chapter, crazy chapter 13.
Really?
Yep. No. Time to start chapter 14. I'm not going to ask you if there's any questions. So, chapter 14, we're winding down. By the way, I gave you this warning last week. Did anybody heed my warning? What was the warning? Study. Like yesterday, a week ago. Because what's coming up? A test. When is your test going to be? It is a week from today. What is your test on? 11, 12, 13, and 14. The nervous system. So, if you haven't started to study yet, shame on you. Start today. Does it ever end? No. It doesn't. By the way, has everybody started registering for classes? Those of you who can? I think the rest of you can start today, for the most part. Was it yesterday? Yeah, Monday. So don't wait, my friends, because to get into the classes that you want to get into, you want to make sure you register in a timely fashion. Otherwise, they're going to get filled up, and you are going to say, oh, I need that class, but I can't get in. That's your own fault. So, yeah, no. And that's when you have to bribe me to let you in. Yeah. Autonomic nervous system. What's that? Automatic stuff. Stuff that happens to innervate things like smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands that we don't think of all the time. Make adjustments to ensure optimal support of different body activities, a lot of the things that we just discussed, and operate via the subconscious control of upper brain regions. So, also called involuntary nervous system or general visceral motor system. So back to that nice little diagram that, of course, we all have committed to memory by now. We're at the end part. Yay! We're at the end part. Yay! So we're talking about the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system. This is motor or efferent and consists of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions in the autonomic nervous system. So somatic versus autonomic nervous system. We see both have motor fibers, but they differ in their effectors, the result, what's going to happen at the end, the efferent pathways, the motor stuff that's coming from central nervous system, and the ganglia or groups of cell bodies that are going to direct this message. That will give us different target organs and responses to different neurotransmitters. So effectors. What's an effector? Something that causes an effect. Very good. Somatic nervous system affects what? Some of those skeletal muscles. Autonomic nervous system, automatic. We're talking about cardiac, smooth muscle in those internal organs, and glands. So efferent pathways and ganglia, some of the somatic nervous system, we're going to find groups of nerves that innervate called group A fibers, and they extend in the spinal or cranial nerves to skeletal muscles. The autonomic pathway uses two neuron chains or two pathways. The preganglionic neurons, we find these guys in the central nervous system. And then the postganglionic neurons outside the central nervous system. So, some of the different neurotransmitters affect the somatic nervous system. All somatic motor neurons release what neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine. So all somatic motor neurons. What's that mean? Yeah, everything that innervates who?
Skeletal.
What kind? Skeletal muscle for movement. And the effects are always going to be some sort of stimulation causing muscles to contract. The autonomic nervous system, we see preganglionic fibers that release acetylcholine. Postganglionic, past the ganglion fibers, release neurotransmitters like norepinephrine or acetylcholine at some of the different effectors. An effect is either stimulatory or inhibitory. So these neurotransmitters can also stop nerve impulses, inhibit. You see this little diagram on page 526 in your textbook. Composition of motor neurons in the somatic and autonomic nervous system. So most spinal and many cranial nerves contain both somatic and autonomic fibers. And adaptations, which we talked about in the previous chapter, involve both skeletal muscles and visceral organs. So, what are the divisions of the autonomic nervous system? We have the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Many of the muscles we're going to discuss with respect to innervation of the autonomic nervous system have something called dual innervation. they're going to get messages from both divisions. So all visceral organs served by both divisions, and we see opposite effects of these divisions. Promotes and maintains activities and conserves body energy. In a person relaxing and reading after a meal, for example, blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rate are low. Why? Well, and it's using that energy to do what? Yeah, digest your food. Gastrointestinal tract is going to be at activity high. Pupils are constricted, lenses accommodated for close vision. All of these things are going on from the autonomic nervous system, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic division is going to help mobilize body during activities, fight or flight. So again, I heard that there was my wonderful hermit cookies up in the bookstore for sale. You're going to make them. You better make them good like they do. So it's going to help mobilize muscle movements, exercise, excitement, emergency, also embarrassment associated with the sympathetic division. We're going to increase heart rate. Why did I have to increase my heart rate if I was running to get cookies in the bookstore? I'm going to use more oxygen because of the increase in muscle contraction. So I'm going to need the delivery of more oxygen, heart rate. What else? Nutrients too, but what else is going to increase besides heart rate? Respiratory rate. Dry mouth. Why would I get a dry mouth? Yeah, it withdraws things it doesn't have to do. Like it doesn't have to make you salivate. I'm busy trying to get your muscles moving so you can run up to the bookstore. Slow that down. Cold, sweaty, skin, dilated pupils are some of the reactions for some of the sympathetic innervations. Not dehydration, no. We're just going to slow down innervation of those responses. Dehydration, dry mouth, does have to do with dehydration, but not with respect to the sympathetic response. If I have to run away from something, I'm not going to get automatically dehydrated, right?
Okay,
see what you're saying? So you're going to feel that response, but it's not because of dehydration, is what I'm trying to get at. Yes? So during vigorous physical activities, we're going to make sure skeletal muscle gets the blood it needs. The heart gets the blood it needs. We're going to dilate bronchioles so we can get more what? More oxygen in, and causes the liver to release glucose. What for what? Yeah, glucose is going to be that quick energy I need. Make my ATP so I can cause those muscles to contract. So all of these are sympathetic division responses. On page 529 in your textbook, table 14.1, we see some of the different physiological differences between parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Now, I'm not going to make you memorize this, so don't panic. But these are some of the different messages that are being sent to some of the different divisions, both parasympathetic and sympathetic. We see this figure 14.3 on page 527 in your textbook. But these are some of the different messages that are being sent to some of the different areas to speed up and slow down functions during any response. So the parasympathetic or craniosacral division of the autonomic nervous system. We're going to see extending from the central nervous system to a target organ. It's going to synapse with postganglionic neurons. in the terminal ganglia. And that's where we are then going to reach our target organ. Short postganglionic fibers are going to synapse with the effectors to then cause an effect. So, cell bodies in the brainstem are going to communicate with preganglionic fibers in facial regions like the oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and regions outside the facial area by communicating with the vagus nerve. Oculomotor nerves, those are going to help with smooth muscles of the eye. Facial nerves, stimulating what? Things in the face region. So large glands in the head. No, any idea? Large glands in the head? Glands. Well, those are some internal brain regions. This guy, think about your face. Salivary glands, lacrimal glands, yes? Sure. Glossopharyngeal nerves, salivary glands as well. Vagus, neck, and nerve plexuses in the thoracic and abdominal region. Again, vagus is going to travel outside that cranial region. The sacral part of the parasympathetic division serves the pelvic organs, the bottom half. From neurons in lateral gray matter in the spinal cord down at the bottom, we see S2 through S4, those sacral nerves. Axons are going to travel in the ventral root of the spinal nerves and synapse with ganglia in the pelvic floor. So we see things like the urinary bladder, ureters, reproductive organs are under control of the sacral part of the parasympathetic division. On page 528, figure 14.4, we see some of the innervation of S2 and S4. Preganglionic neurons are in the spinal cord segments from T1 to L2 in the thoracolumnar division of the sympathetic nervous system. On page, where is this? There it is. Page 532, figure 14.6. We see some of the different organs innervated by this group in the parasympathetic division. Sympathetic trunks and pathways. Sympathetic is what?
That's the speed up.
It's the speed up guy. I want to see 23 vertebral ganglia in the sympathetic trunk chain. 3 cervical, 11 thoracic, 4 lumbar, 4 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. We see some of the locations of in the sympathetic trunk of some of these different ganglia on page 530 in the textbook, figure 14.5. So, when we enter the sympathetic trunk ganglia, that group of fibers, we're going to synapse with ganglionic neurons in the same trunk ganglia, and then we're going to ascend or descend sympathetic trunk for our response. Remember, we need to process in the central nervous system this information before we cause an effect. So the pathways of sympathetic innervation are outlined in this particular portion of the diagram. Again, that's figure 14.5 on page 530. I'm not going to make you memorize the specifics of this. So do not panic.
Your white ramus, that's myelinated. Your gray would be non-myelinated.
Correct. Or cell bodies. Cell in ganglia, for example. So, we synapse at a higher or lower level, and then an effect is the result. So, post-ganglionic axons, enter the ventral rami. Ventral is what? Ventral is motor. 3 fibers innervate sweat glands. What's an erector pili muscle? Yeah, it makes your hair stand up on end. When we discuss the integumentary system, we'll look at tiny little muscles associated with all the hair follicles in your cutaneous system. And those are erector pili muscles. And then we also see fibers that innervate vascular smooth muscle in your blood vessels to look at some of the differences in blood delivery. I need more, I need less. Pathways to the head. Fibers emerge from the thoracic region T1 through T4 and synapse in the superior cervical ganglion. We see these fibers, they're going to innervate some of the skin and blood vessels of the head, and this is what causes you sometimes to get really red-faced when you're either embarrassed or you're angry. Stimulate dilator muscles of the iris. That's when my pupils dilate in response to some sort of stimulus. Inhibit nasal and salivary glands, again, because I'm busy taking care of everybody else, and innervate smooth muscle in the upper eyelid and branches to the heart. Some of the pathways to the thorax also help innervate heart via cardiac plexuses that are going to help with heart rate. When we talk about the cardiovascular system, we're also going to talk about a group of cells called autorhythmic cells that are also going to play a role in keeping the rhythm of the heart. Thyroid gland and the skin. What's the thyroid gland doing for me? Anybody know what thyroid hormones do for me? Yeah, control metabolic processes, metabolism.
Like thyroid somewhere as well, they can either get obese or...
Yep, and other things, problems with different growth things as well. So when we talk about thyroid hormones in the endocrine system, we're going to talk about metabolic rate and the rate of metabolic processes, how fast reactions take place in the body. Also, lungs and esophagus are some of the fibers that we discuss here as well. Pathways with synapses in collateral ganglia. What's a collateral ganglia? Yeah, connections to the side. Most fibers in T5 through L2 synapse in collateral ganglia. So when we talked about crossing over of pathways, these guys are involved in that as well. They form thoracic, lumbar, and sacral splanchnic, that word, nerves. Why I can't say it today? And their ganglia include the celiac and the superior and inferior mesenteric. So we're talking about what organs in the body? The mesentery. Anybody? Yeah, in that ventral region, digestive organs. So, synapses occur in celiac and superior mesenteric ganglia, controlling different abdominal regions. Postganglionic fibers serve the stomach, intestines, liver, spleen, and kidneys. Are you ready to explode yet? Okay, are you telling me you want me to stop? All right. I will continue with pathways to the pelvis on Thursday. Thursday you also have what? A quiz on what? Chapter 13. So Chapter 13 quiz on Thursday. Did everybody click in? All righty. See ya.